The caseworker's car pulled off at the end of the gravel drive and did not come any closer. She said Kaylee's place was easy to find, and I guess it was, because there wasn't much else on the road. Just fields on both sides, cut low, and a mailbox with the name Hawkins painted on the side in letters that had faded to almost nothing. I stood there with my duffel bag and looked at the house, white clapboard, paint peeling at the corners where the wood had swelled and cracked. Behind it, maybe 60 yards back, a barn the color of driftwood, gray and weathered, with a hay door up top and fields running south from it until they hit a wall of pine scrub. The car's engine faded down the county road. Then it was just me and the sound of wind moving through soybeans. I hadn't taken 3 steps up the drive before the screen door opened. My grandmother came out onto the porch before I got anywhere near the steps. She was smaller than I remembered, compact, her gray hair cut short and practical, wearing canvas pants and a shirt still dirty at the knees from whatever she'd been doing that morning. She looked at me the way you'd look at a delivery you'd been expecting but weren't in any hurry about. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "Come in and I'll show you your room." No hug, no how was the drive. She just held the door. I'd met her maybe a dozen times in my life, most of them Christmases I barely remembered, and I didn't know her well enough to know if that was how she always was, or if it was just how she was with me. My dad always said she was quiet. He never said what that quiet was covering, if anything. What I did know was that she'd lived alone out here for 20 years, since my grandfather died, and that she ran the farm herself, and that the Newberry County woman who dropped me off had called her the least complicated option while my parents sorted out custody in front of a judge. Weeks, the caseworker said. Maybe months. She said it like she was guessing. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and something baked days ago. My grandmother led me up a narrow staircase to a small room at the end of the hall, clean, plain, a bed with a quilt pulled tight, a window that looked out over the back of the property. "Supper's at 6, she said. "Breakfast is 5:45. I don't sleep past 5:30 and I don't expect you to either. The farm runs on a schedule." Then she left me to unpack, her footsteps going back down the stairs at the same even pace they'd come up. I set my bag on the bed and didn't unpack right away. I sat down instead and looked out the window. The barn sat square in the middle of the view, gray boards gone silver in places, a brass padlock hanging on the hasp of the main door. It looked like any other barn. I'd grown up around nothing like it, but I'd seen enough on television and in the backgrounds of other people's farms to know what a barn was supposed to look like. I noticed it, but only in passing. Then I stopped noticing it and unpacked my clothes into the dresser. 4 drawers, more than I needed for what I'd brought. Supper was at 6, same as she'd said. She'd made a pot roast, though I didn't ask and she didn't offer an explanation, and we ate at a table built for more people than sat at it. "Any food allergies?" she said, not really a question. "No." She nodded, and that was it. She didn't ask about school or my parents or the drive from Columbia or anything else a person might ask a boy who'd just been dropped on their porch. She ate steadily, looking mostly at her plate, and I did the same, and the quiet between us didn't feel unfriendly. Outside the kitchen window, the light was starting to go gray at the edges, the fields losing their color first, then the tree line, then the barn. I cleared my plate when I was done and carried it to the sink the way she had hers. "Good night," I said. She didn't look up from the paper she'd unfolded on the table. "Night." I went up the stairs to my room. The window still showed me the barn, dark now and locked, sitting out there in the yard. My grandmother was up before 6 every morning. I know this because I heard her boots on the stairs at 5:45, twice. And after that I quit waiting to hear it, and just got up when I heard the first creak. She didn't wake me. She didn't knock on my door or call up the stairs. She just went out to the fields, and if I wasn't down by the time she started the truck, that was on me. By 6:15, we were both out there. She never told me what we were doing or why. She'd walk a row, check something at the base of a plant, move on. I followed her and watched her hands and figured it out from that. Nobody explained irrigation to me. Nobody explained the fence line, or which tools lived in which drawer of the shed, or why she checked the water trough before she checked anything else. She just did the thing, and I learned it by watching her do it. She moved like she'd done every single task on that property 10,000 times. No wasted motion. No pause to think about the next step. Every morning, my walk to the equipment shed took me past the barn. I passed within 10 feet of the main door. There was a padlock on the hasp, ordinary brass, a little tarnished at the shackle, the kind you'd find in a bin at any hardware store for $6. I noticed it the way you notice a mailbox. I kept walking. We worked until midday, and then we ate lunch in the kitchen, and lunch was quiet the same way the mornings were quiet. She read a seed catalog while she ate, or sometimes a bill, holding it close to her face without her glasses. I ate and looked out the window at the fields we'd just come from. Neither of us seemed to need to talk. I decided that was just how it was going to be here, and I got used to it faster than I expected to. Afternoons were smaller jobs, a fence post that had gone soft, the mower deck, the kitchen garden behind the house, where she showed me. This time she did show me, actually crouched down and pointed, how to tell a bean plant that needed water from one that just looked tired. By 8:30, she was in her chair in the living room with the lamp on, and the house went still around her like a held breath. I'd go up to my room not long after. That was 2 days, more or less the same shape twice. On the third night, we had pork chops, green beans out of the garden, and cornbread, and I was scraping the last of it around my plate when she reached into the pocket of her house dress and slid an index card across the table. She didn't look up when she did it. I picked it up. The handwriting was careful, upright, each letter set down like she'd thought about it before she wrote it. 4 things I could do after dark: walk the near yard, use the equipment shed, sit on the porch, read in the kitchen. 3 things I couldn't: don't leave food out after dark, don't look at the barn from the upstairs windows at night, and under that, in the same careful hand, do not go to the barn after the lock changes. I read it twice. I set it down on the table between us. What does after the lock changes mean? She reached for her water glass and filled it from the pitcher, took a drink, set it back down. The lock on the barn changes on its own some nights, she said. Around 9 o'clock. You'll know it when it happens because you'll hear a click from inside the house. She picked her fork back up. That's the rule, she said. When you hear the click, you stay inside. She finished the last of her cornbread like that was the end of it. I waited. She didn't add anything. Changes to what? She stood and carried her plate to the sink. A different lock, she said over her shoulder. She turned the water on, and that was it. She rinsed the plate, set it in the rack, and didn't say another word. I sat there with the card in front of me. I turned it over. The back was blank. I thought about the quiet mornings since I'd arrived, and I put the card in that pile. I decided that was all this was. I carried my own plate to the sink after hers, said goodnight, and went up. My room looked out over the near yard and past it to the barn, a gray shape against a grayer sky. I could just make out the hasp from the window and the lock hanging from it. Ordinary, exactly the size and shape it had been every morning I'd walked past it. I set the index card on the windowsill above my bed and lay down. Nothing happened for 4 nights, and I started to file the card away in my head, next to everything else about her that was just her. I washed dishes. I sat on the porch and watched the fields go from green to gray to nothing at all. I read the same 3 paperbacks she kept on a shelf by the wood stove, none of which I would have picked out for myself. The brass lock stayed brass. Every morning I walked past the barn on my way to the equipment shed, and it looked exactly the way a lock is supposed to look, dull and simple and closed. I decided she'd lived alone too long and built little ceremonies to get through the dark. My mother's aunt used to walk the perimeter of her house every night before bed with a flashlight, checking windows that were never unlocked. On the fourth night, I was at the sink finishing the dishes, the water running hot over a plate, and when I reached over and shut the faucet off, the kitchen went quiet all at once. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud. Loud would have been easier. It was low, and it had a kind of roundness to it, and I felt it somewhere under my ribs, like a whole combination lock spinning through every number it owns, all of them landing at the same instant. I didn't move. My hands were still on the edge of the sink, water dripping off my fingers onto the counter. I looked out the window over the sink, the one that lines up with the yard and the barn beyond it. The barn was dark, same as always, but the lock on the hasp wasn't the one I'd walked past that morning. The brass one was gone. In its place was something bigger, black, no shine to it at all, no shape where a keyhole should be. It just sat there on the hasp, not hanging like the brass one did. Sitting. It sat like it had never been anywhere else and had no plan to move. I stood at that window for a long time, long enough that the water I'd left running in my head kept dripping even after I knew it had stopped. I didn't go outside. I dried my hands on my jeans and went looking for her instead, walking fast through the front hall with the whole speech already built in my head. I heard it. I want to know what that is. Don't tell me it's nothing. She was in her chair in the living room, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, one over the other, still. I stood in the doorway and watched her chest for the rise that would tell me she was only asleep. It came, slow and even, but it didn't tell me anything, because a person who wanted you to think she was asleep would breathe exactly like that. I stood there for a full minute, maybe longer. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't say my name. She just sat there, and the room sat there with her. And after a while, I understood that whatever answer I was going to get, I wasn't getting it tonight. I went up to bed. I lay on top of the covers with my shoes still on, looking at the ceiling, and then at the window, and then at the ceiling again. My room looks out over the same stretch of yard as the kitchen does, and from up there I could see the barn clear enough. A dark shape against a sky that was only a little less dark, the black lock a smaller, denser shape hanging off the side of it. Nothing moved. No light came on. No sound came from downstairs. No creak of her chair. No footsteps on the stairs. I kept waiting for something to happen, the way you wait for a second knock after the first one wakes you up. It didn't come. The yard and the barn stayed the way they were, and I lay there with my eyes on that black shape on the hasp until, at some point I couldn't have named if you'd asked me, I fell asleep watching it. I woke up still on top of the covers, my shoes still on, the light in the room already gray and flat. I went down before breakfast, straight across the yard, and the brass lock was back on the hasp like it had never left. I crouched and put both hands around it. It was warm, not sun warm. The morning was overcast, the whole sky the color of a nickel, and the barn had been sitting in shade since before I woke up. It was warm the way a doorknob is warm after somebody's hand has been on it. I held it a second longer than I needed to, and then I let go and went in for breakfast. Grandma was already at the stove. I put the index card on the table between us, the one she'd slid across without a word 3 nights before, and I sat down across from her. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it," I said. "Tell me what that was." She brought the eggs over and set the pan down before she answered. She sat, picked up her fork, ate one more bite, and then set the fork down flat against the plate. "The barn has been locking itself since Dan died," she said. "Dan had an arrangement with something that lives on the land. That arrangement included the barn being available on certain nights. An arrangement with what? Something that was already here when Dan broke the land. She said it the way she said everything. Flat, like she was reading off a seed count. He came to terms with it in 1987. The terms were that it got the barn on nights of its choosing, and in exchange the farm stayed productive. He called it a tenancy, she added, like that explained something. What are the rules? Don't go in the barn when the lock is changed. Don't look at it from the upstairs windows on those nights. Don't leave food out after dark. She counted them off without raising her voice, the way you'd list ingredients. I've kept all 3 for 20 years. What's in the barn on those nights? I stopped knowing after Dan died. She looked at me when she said it, not away, and there was nothing behind her eyes that looked like fear or apology. The only rule that matters is the lock, she said. Not the arrangement, not the word tenancy, not even the idea that something had been living on this land longer than anybody in it. It was the way she said the only rule that matters is the lock, the same way she'd tell me the weather was turning. And I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and felt my hands go cold around it. I didn't ask anything else. She got up and took her plate to the sink, and that was the end of it. Over the next week, I didn't break the rule. I just got closer to its edges. Twice more the click came, and both times I was already at the kitchen window with the lights off, watching the hasp instead of my own reflection in the glass. Both times the brass lock was gone before I could count to 3 after the sound, and the black one was there instead, low and squat and without a keyhole I could ever find even in daylight. I started keeping the time on my phone. The click never came before 9. It never came after 9:20. It sat in that window like something on the land kept better time than the county did. Every morning after, I went out before breakfast and put my hand on the brass lock, and every morning it was warm, no matter how the night had gone, no matter what the sky looked like. By the end of the week, it wasn't a strange habit of an old woman living alone anymore. It wasn't something I could file next to the way she folded newspaper into the wood stove instead of using kindling, or the way she never left a light on past 9:30 even when I was still up reading. It was a fact of the property, the way the well was a fact of the property, or the fence line was. I did my work. I ate my meals across from her and didn't bring it up again, and she didn't either, and the days went by ordinary on top and not ordinary underneath. The way a pond looks flat until you know what's down in it. Tuesday was ordinary at first, hot in the afternoon and cooling fast once the sun dropped behind the tree line. I'd spent part of it in the barn fixing the come-along on the equipment shelf, and I'd left my phone charging off the outlet by the workbench because it was the only outlet out there that worked. I remembered it at 8:50, standing in the kitchen with a dish rag in my hand, the charger sitting on that bench like it hadn't crossed my mind once since lunch. I looked out the window. The brass lock was still on the hasp, ordinary and cool in the porch light, same as it had been every evening that wasn't the night. I did the math. 9 o'clock at the earliest, 9:20 at the latest. 10 minutes, maybe, before the window closed on me for good. I took the key off the hook by the back door and went out across the yard. The brass lock was right where it always was. Ordinary. Cool under my fingers. I turned the key and the shackle popped free and I let myself in. Quick, not bothering to shut the door all the way behind me. The charger was on the workbench exactly where I'd left it. I grabbed it and turned toward the door, already thinking about the dish rag still balled up in my other hand back in the kitchen, already thinking I'd made it with time to spare. Then the click happened. From inside the barn, it wasn't a sound so much as a thing that passed through me. I felt it in my chest and in the bottoms of my feet at the same time, like something enormous had turned over somewhere underground. I stood there with the charger in my hand and didn't move. I went to the gap between the doorboards and looked out. The brass lock was gone. In its place, seated on the hasp, was the black one, The shackle closed through the loop like it had never been any other way. I was inside. The door was locked from the outside. I killed my phone light. My thumb just did it. Then I was moving, quiet as I could, back to the corner behind the hay bales, into the angle where two boards met, and I got down low and made myself small and waited. 2 minutes, maybe. I didn't have a way to be sure. Then something started walking around the outside of the barn. I tracked it by the sound of it in the dirt. Footfalls even, deliberate, not hurried at all. Not the way a person walks. These came exactly spaced, like something counting, and just slightly too slow, like whatever was under the sound had all the time it wanted. It went all the way around, one full circuit, and then it stopped at the main door. It didn't try the handle. It didn't push. It just stood there, and I heard it breathing against the wood. A wet sound, low, slow, going on and on. I stayed still. I didn't turn my phone back on. I counted my own breaths so I wouldn't make any noise doing it wrong. In for 4. Out for 4. In for 4. The breathing kept going, long enough that I lost the count more than once and had to start it over. Then it stopped. The footfalls started again, moving off around the side of the barn, and then there was nothing. No steps, no breath. Just the barn, dark, and me in the corner of it with my knees against my chest. I stayed there anyway. The gap in the roof boards went from black to a deep kind of blue, and I watched that happen without moving, and then the blue went pale and gray, and that was morning, or close enough to it that I trusted it. When there was enough light to see the door by, I got up and tried it. It opened. No resistance at all, like it had never been locked in the first place. I stepped out into the cold and looked at the hasp. Nothing on it. No black lock, no brass one, nothing at all. Just the bare metal loop hanging there in the gray light. I stood in the yard a while. Then I went in and ate breakfast across from Kaylee, and neither one of us said anything about where I'd spent the night. When I went back out, the brass lock was on the hasp again, hanging there like it had always been there. I stand in the yard now, holding it in both hands. It's warm. Not morning warmth. The sky was still overcast, no sun in it yet, but the warmth something gets from being held or handled recently and a lot. I look at the barn door. I hang the brass lock back on the hasp and go inside for breakfast. The rest of that week I don't talk about it. Kaylee doesn't ask. But something has shifted, and by Thursday I find myself standing in front of the back room off the barn's rear wall, the one I noticed my first week and never went into. Plank partition, a doorway cut through it, no door. I always figured it was just where Dan kept his junk. I go in now. There's a workbench along the far wall, a shelf of journals above it, water-stained, arranged by year in handwriting so careful it looks printed. A tin box sits on the bench with a hasp lock through the latch. I pull the earliest journal off the shelf and open it on the bench. Farm records, yields, weather, what broke, and what got fixed. Dan's handwriting doesn't waver from page to page, like he wrote the same way whether it was raining or not. There are little personal lines dropped in between the numbers. A note about a dog, a note about Kaylee's garden. I carry the whole stack inside and start reading at the kitchen table. I go in order. I'm looking for the first mention of it, whatever it is, and I find it in a journal from 1987. One line, tucked between a note about the price of feed and a note about rain. Come to terms with the tenant today. The farm will do well by it. Before that entry, the journals read like any farmer's journals. After it, something changes. The sentences get shorter, fewer personal lines. I go back out to the barn for the tin box. It's locked. I try the hasp anyway, more out of habit than hope, and it doesn't move. I go through the back room looking for a key, the shelf, the drawers under the bench, the floor around the legs of it. Nothing. Then I get down and look under the bench itself, and there's a boot back there, an old work boot gone stiff with age, and stuck down in the toe of it is a small brass key. The name written in marker on the heel is Dan's. The key fits. I lift the lid and there's one thing inside, folded in quarters. 4 pages, handwritten, dated April 1987. It reads like a lease. Plain language, no flourish. The kind of thing you'd sign for a rental house. It names Dan Hawkins as landowner. It never names the other party. It calls them the tenant, every time. All 4 pages. The tenant gets the barn structure on nights of its choosing. In exchange, the farm stays productive. Renewable every 10 years. A sealed envelope, left in this box, on the renewal date. There's a section near the bottom of the last page headed penalties. I read it twice. First occurrence, a marking. Second occurrence, a taking. Third occurrence, nothing. The line just stops. Whatever goes there, Dan left it blank. Nowhere in 4 pages does it say what the tenant is, where it comes from, what it looks like, if it looks like anything. Dan wrote around it the whole time, the way you'd write around a name you didn't want to say out loud. I put the agreement back in the box and go looking for the last journal. It's the one nearest the end of the shelf. Water stains worse on this one than the others, like it sat somewhere damp for a while. I sit down on the barn floor with it because my legs don't feel like carrying me back to the house. The entries end 3 days before Dan died in 2004. I read slow. Weather. A busted fence line. A note about Kaylee needing help with the truck. The last entry is 1 line. It's been asking about the boy. I sit there a long time. There was no boy on this property in 2004. I know that. Kaylee's been alone here 20 years. I'm 16, and I got here 3 weeks ago. And Dan has been dead since before I was old enough to remember anything. He wrote that about me. I closed the journal and put it back on the shelf where I found it, and I was still sitting there when I heard a truck coming up the drive. It was Tim. He had a borrowed truck and a duffel bag and a grin that made it seem like showing up unannounced was a favor he was doing us. "Didn't know you were coming," Kaylee said, and set a 3rd plate at the table without another word about it. Tim's 18, my cousin through a different branch, and he treats the farm like a place you go when you need to get away from something. He never says what. Over dinner, he asked about the barn. He'd only been here 2 hours, and he'd already decided it was the best thing on the property. "So, what's the deal with the barn?" he said, forking up green beans. "Dottie won't let you in there or something?" I tried to explain it. The lock, the sound, the 9 o'clock window, the thing on the land that used the barn on certain nights and left the farm alone the rest of the time. I watched his face while I talked. It went from interested to something closer to amused. "Got it," he said. "So it's a haunted barn situation." He changed the subject before I could answer. That first night, no click came. I sat up until 10 with my ear half turned toward the window, listening for it, and when it didn't come, I felt stupid for waiting and went to bed. In the morning, Tim was at the table eating cereal, asking Kaylee when the barn was built, easy and loose, and I felt more stupid still. The second night, the click came at 9:30. I heard it from my bed, and I was down the hall to Tim's room before I'd finished sitting up. The room was empty. The window was open. The screen was pushed out, leaning against the house below it. I ran across the yard. The black lock was on the hasp. I hit the wall with my fist. "Tim!" His voice came back, muffled through the boards, confused. "What? Hang on, what's going on?" "Tim, get away from the door. Don't touch anything." The edge came into his voice then, not quite panic yet, but headed there. "Cody, I can't..." Then a sound, sharp, cut off before it finished being a word. Then nothing. I hit the wall again. Nothing. I tried the hasp and the black lock held the way it always held. I went around the whole barn looking for a gap, a loose board, anything, and there wasn't one. I woke Kaylee. She came out to the back porch in her house dress and looked at the barn for a long moment before she said anything. "There is nothing to do until morning." She said it like this wasn't the first time she'd thought it. We sat on the porch. She made coffee at some point and brought 2 cups out without asking if I wanted one. I watched the barn. Nothing moved around it that I could hear. Around 2 in the morning, a sound came from inside. Low, not Tim's voice. Something underneath his voice. And it held for several seconds and then it stopped. Neither of us said anything about it. At first light, the brass lock was back on the hasp. I opened the door and the barn was empty. I ran back out and around, and Tim was sitting in the dirt on the other side, in front of the same door, like he'd come out while I was going in. His knees were up and his arms rested on them, and he was looking at the ground. Tim. He looked up slow, like the sound of his name took a second to arrive. "What day is it?" he said. "You don't remember coming out here?" "I don't." He stopped. "I don't remember going out here." I looked at his arms. Fine lines, evenly spaced, running from the inside of his wrist to the inside of his elbow, on both arms. Not deep, not bleeding. They looked less like something that had hurt him, and more like marks a carpenter makes before he cuts. I thought about the page in the tin box. First occurrence, a marking. Tim left that afternoon. He didn't ask what the lines were. He didn't look at them again after the first time, out in the dirt, when he turned his arm over once and then didn't do it a second time. Kaylee stood on the porch and watched his truck go down the county road. She didn't wave. I stood beside her, knowing the marks on his arms were exactly what the agreement called a first occurrence, and that as far as I knew, the agreement was still standing. 3 days after Tim's truck went down the county road, I stopped in front of the mantel. I'd walked past that photograph every morning for 3 weeks. Grandpa Dan standing in the near yard, squinting into the sun, the barn behind his left shoulder. I could have drawn it from memory. But that morning, something in it caught, the way a word looks wrong if you stare at it too long, and I stopped and looked again. The barn doors were open. They hadn't been open before. I was certain of it. And in the open doorway, in the dark gap between the boards, something stood that wasn't supposed to be there. I carried the photograph into the kitchen. Kaylee was at the stove. "This photo," I said. "The barn doors are open in it." She glanced over, then back at the eggs. "The photo has always looked like that." She said it flat, no defense in it at all, the way she told me the time or the weather. I held the frame up to the window, into the full light. The doors were open. Something dark filled the space between them, angled forward, tilted toward Dan's shoulder like it was leaning in to listen to something he was about to say. It hadn't been like that a week ago. I would have noticed. I didn't say anything else. I set the photograph on the counter, ate my eggs, and didn't look at it again until I carried it upstairs that afternoon and put it face down in a drawer. That evening I went out to the barn. The tin box was still on the workbench where Dan had left it 30 years before. I lifted the lid. Empty. The agreement was gone. I checked the shelf, the journals stacked in their water-stained order, the drawers under the bench where Dan kept nails and twine and a coffee can of loose screws. Nothing. I got down on my knees and checked the floor in case it had slid, in case the wind had gotten it, though there was no wind in a barn with the doors shut. Nothing. I straightened up, and my eyes went to the nail by the door where I'd hung my jacket that afternoon, out of habit, on the same nail Dan had used for 30 years. I lifted the jacket off. A single page was folded behind it, tucked against the wood. I opened it under the bulb hanging from the rafter. It was the penalties section, Dan's handwriting running down the page in that careful, functional script. First occurrence, a marking. Second occurrence, a taking. Third occurrence left blank, the way it had been the first time I read it. But there was writing in the margin now that hadn't been there before, next to the first line. 2 words, in ink that still had a shine to it, in a hand that curved wrong, too smooth, too even, nothing like Dan's. The boy. I stood there under the bulb for longer than I want to say. Then I folded the page, put it in my jacket pocket, and walked back to the house with the photograph still face down in the drawer upstairs and this new thing in my hand. Kaylee was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. I set the page down. Then I went and got the photograph and set that down too. "The box is empty," I said. "The agreement's gone. This page was the only piece I could find. Look at the margin." She looked. She didn't touch it right away. "There's a journal entry from right before Dan died," I said. "It's been asking about the boy. There wasn't a boy here then. I think he wrote that about me, 20 years early." I sat down across from her. "I need to know everything, all of it, not pieces." Kaylee sat with the page a long time, long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer at all, that she was going to get up and rinse her cup and leave me at the table the way she'd left me at the table over the index card 3 weeks before. But she didn't get up. "The agreement renews every 10 years, she said. "Dan renewed it in 1997. Sealed envelope, left in the box on the date. That's how it works. It was due again in early September, 3 weeks before you got here." "Did he renew at that time?" "He died in 2004. The renewal was still running on the last one he'd done. It kept going on its own until the 10 years ran out again this year." She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn, not drinking it. "It lapsed 3 weeks ago." "You didn't renew it?" "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the page and not at me. "Dan had an envelope prepared before he died, left it in his desk, unsealed, with a note saying I'd know when to use it. I didn't seal it. I didn't put it in the box." She set the cup down. "I didn't want to commit you to something you hadn't chosen." I didn't say anything. "I knew you were coming before the social worker called," she said. "I'd been expecting you." The kitchen was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycling. "What happens when it lapses?" I said. "What happens now?" "Without a renewal, the tenant's access isn't limited to the barn anymore." She said it the way she said everything, without any weight added to carry it. "It'll move to the house." I understood, looking at her face, that she had known this since before I ever got off the bus in Prosperity. That she had been carrying it quietly the whole 3 weeks I'd been learning her rhythms and thinking her strange for a lock on a barn door. I sat there with the page in front of me, the boy written fresh in the margin beside the first occurrence, and the photograph beside it with the dark shape leaning toward Dan's shoulder like it had something to say to him, and understood that whatever had been keeping to the barn all these years wasn't keeping to anything anymore. "Is there a way to end it?" I said, "instead of renewing it?" Kaylee didn't answer right away. She got up and got the coffee pot and poured herself more. "Yes," she said. "The agreement has a voiding clause." I waited. "The tin box has to be placed inside the barn during an access night, while the tenant is present and left there. That voids the agreement." She sat back down. "That means going in during an access night." I looked at the page in front of me, at the word boy written fresh in the margin. "What would he have done?" I said. "Dan." She was quiet a moment. "He always renewed it," she said. "He was afraid of it his whole life, and he renewed it anyway, every 10 years, because he believed the farm depended on it." She said I got to make a choice he never had, that the clause required the box to be left by somebody who wasn't part of the original agreement. "Why does it have to be somebody else?" I said. "The agreement names Dan as the landowner and me as his household." She said it flatly, the way she said everything. "The clause requires somebody outside that. I think he wrote it knowing there'd eventually be a boy on this property. I think he built the door for whoever came after him." I didn't say anything for a while. "I want to think about it," I said. She nodded. She didn't push me either way. For the next 2 days, I went back to the barn's back room and read through the journals again, slower this time, looking at the entries around the renewal dates. 1987, 1997. The entries before each one were short and dry, just weather and yield and what needed fixing on the tractor, the handwriting tight and small like he was rationing the ink. The entries after were different, longer. He wrote about the tomatoes coming in heavy that year. He wrote about a hawk he'd watched over the south field for most of an afternoon. He never once wrote what the tenant was. He wrote what it left behind. I sat on the workbench with the last journal open in my lap, to the last page he ever wrote in it, 3 days before he died. It's been asking about the boy. I read it again. There was no boy on this farm in 2004. There wasn't going to be one for 20 years. I thought about the voiding clause requiring somebody outside the agreement. I closed the journal. On the second morning, I came down for breakfast and she was already at the stove. "I'm going to void it," I said, "on the next access night." She turned the heat down under the pan before she looked at me. She nodded once. After we ate, she got up without a word and went into the front room, and I heard the desk drawer, the one that always stuck a little before it gave. She came back with an envelope. It wasn't sealed. She set it on the table between us like she'd set the index card down that first week. No explanation, no lead-up. "Dan left this," she said. "I was going to use it for the renewal." She sat back down across from me. "I want you to read what's inside before you decide you've decided." I opened it. There was a single card inside, his handwriting, the same tight hand from the early journal entries. "To whatever comes next," it said. "I'm sorry I couldn't end it myself. The farm is worth less than you think." I read it twice. I folded it along the crease he'd already made and put it in my shirt pocket, against my chest, and I didn't say anything else about it. Kaylee got up and started clearing the plates, the fork scraping once against the china, and she didn't say anything either. I sat at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of me starting at 8:45. I was already dressed, boots on. I'd put the card Dan wrote in my shirt pocket that morning and hadn't taken it out since, and I could feel the corner of it against my chest when I breathed. Kaylee sat in the living room. I could hear the chair creak once, early on, and then nothing. Neither of us had said a word since supper. There wasn't anything left to say that we hadn't already said 3 nights before, and saying it again wouldn't have made it easier. At 9:05, the click came. I felt it before I heard it, same as always, low and round and centered somewhere behind my ribs. I stood up. I picked up the box. It was lighter than I expected, considering what it had been holding for 30 years, and I carried it out the back door and across the yard with both hands, the way you'd carry something that might spill. The night was clear. No wind. The kind of dark where you can still see the tree line against the sky if you look for it. The black lock was on the hasp. I reached for it, expecting it to fight me, expecting to need the key I didn't have, and instead it opened in my hand. No resistance. The shackle just pulled free, easy, like it had been waiting on me to try. And standing there with it open in my palm, I understood something Dan never wrote down in any of the journals. The lock had never been keeping anybody out. It was keeping something in. It was a sign on a door. Occupied. I set it down in the dirt and pushed the door open. The barn was dark, but it was a different dark than I was used to standing in. Not deeper. Just more there. like the air had a thickness to it I hadn't felt before, something you could almost lean on. I didn't turn my phone light on. I don't know why. It didn't feel like a place you were supposed to bring light into. Something was near the back wall. I couldn't see it so much as feel where it was. A patch of dark that sat wrong against the dark around it, like a hole cut in a photograph. When I stepped through the door, it went still. I stood there in the doorway with the box in my hands and let it decide. Then I walked to the middle of the floor. I set the box down. I straightened up. My legs didn't want to hold me right, and I made them anyway. "The arrangement is over," I said. "I'm leaving the box. The agreement is void." My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. It didn't sound like anything in that barn. It sounded like a kid's voice, which is what it was. The thing near the back wall moved, not toward me, toward the box. It crossed the floor, and the barn filled with a sound like wind pushed through a pipe too narrow for it, low and sustained, rising a little and then just stopping, all at once, the way a radio cuts off. I backed toward the door. One step, then another. I kept my face toward the inside of the barn the whole way. I reached the threshold. I stepped clear. The black lock fell off the hasp behind me and hit the dirt at my feet with a sound too small for what it meant. I didn't pick it up. I walked back across the yard. I didn't run. My legs were shaking enough that running might have put me on the ground. Kaylee was standing at the kitchen window. She'd watched the whole thing. I could tell by the way she didn't ask and by the way she was already at the table by the time I came through the back door. I sat across from her. She didn't ask me what happened. I don't think either of us had the words for it, or wanted to find them right then. We just sat there, the two of us, at that table. Outside the window, the sky went from black to gray as morning came on. The black lock lay where it had fallen in the dirt in front of the barn door. Neither one of us said anything at all. I went to the barn before breakfast, the way I had every morning since the click stopped coming. The hasp was bare, no black lock, no brass one. I pushed the door and it swung open. Inside it was just a barn. The hay bales sat where they'd always sat. The tools hung on their hooks along the near wall, the same tools, catching the same gray morning light through the gap in the roof. The workbench in the back room was bare. The tin box was gone from the floor where I'd left it. Dan's journals were still on the shelf, 30 years of them, spines cracked and swollen with damp. I stood in the middle of the floor for a minute anyway, just to be sure, and then I went into breakfast. The soybeans started going wrong in October. I noticed it before Kaylee said anything about it, walking the rows on my way to check the fence line. The plants that should have been thick and dark had gone pale, thin in the stem, the leaves curling at the edges like they couldn't decide whether to hold on through the season. Kaylee walked the same rows a few days later and didn't say much. She just looked at them longer than she usually looked at anything. The harvest came in at a fraction of what she'd counted on. 30 years without a bad one, she told me once, early on, when I asked why she still kept records going back that far. This was the first. I found her at the kitchen table on a morning near the end of the month, a ledger open in front of her and a calculator sitting beside it, the kind with the paper tape curling out the top. She didn't look up when I sat down across from her. She turned the ledger so I could read it. The number at the bottom wasn't underlined or circled. She'd just written it, plain, in the same hand she used for everything. "I'm going to sell the back 40, she said. "That land's been in Dan's family since his grandfather broke it, in 1931. She said it looking at the numbers, not at me. She didn't say what it cost her to say it. She didn't have to. I didn't tell her I was sorry. I didn't tell her it was the right thing to do, and she hadn't asked me to say either one. I just sat there and looked at the number with her for a while, the two of us doing the same arithmetic in our heads, coming out the same place. That evening I called my mom. "I want to come home whenever you and Dad get this figured out," I told her. She was quiet on the line for a second. "I don't know when that'll be, Cody," she said. "I'll wait," I said. I meant it. We worked the fields through the rest of October and into November, loading what there was to load, hauling it, cleaning the equipment down and greasing the fittings before we put it away for winter, the same as any year. The same rhythm Kaylee had kept for 20 years alone before I ever showed up on her porch with a duffel bag and a social worker's business card in my pocket. She was up before 6. She worked until midday and ate lunch without talking and was in her chair by 8:30 every night, same as always. I didn't go into the barn again. Not because anything told me not to. Nothing in there needed watching anymore. I just didn't have any reason to be in it. And out here, I'd learned to notice the difference between a place that was mine to walk into and a place that wasn't. On a morning in November, frost still thin on the grass, I walked past the barn on my way to the equipment shed to pull the tarp off the tiller before the ground froze hard. The hasp was bare. The door was shut, the way it had been shut every morning for weeks. I didn't stop. I kept walking toward the shed, my breath showing white in front of me, the frost cracking a little under my boots, and behind me, the barn just stood there in the pale early light, quiet, empty, done with whatever it had ever been for.